The morning of April 17th, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Elwyn Righetti sat motionless in the jeep at Royal Air Force Wormingford, drawing slow, weary breaths. It was his 30th birthday. Around him, the English countryside was awakening to what would be one of the war's final spring mornings. In a few weeks, perhaps days, Germany would surrender. Everyone knew it. The Third Reich was collapsing from both east and west, its armies in retreat, its cities in ruins, its Luftwaffe nearly extinct. Righetti looked at the slip of paper in his hand. Mission number 957, bomber escort to Dresden, then freedom to hunt targets of opportunity on the return. He had flown enough missions. He had earned enough combat hours. He was close, so close to rotating home to California, to his wife Catherine and their young daughter Kine, to the ranch near San Luis Obispo, where he had been born and raised. Just a few more missions, and he would be done with this war. But on this morning, looking at that slip of paper, Elwyn Righetti made a decision that would transform him into a legend and a mystery. He would not fly cautiously. He would not simply escort the bombers and return safely. He would do what he had done better than any other pilot in the 8th Air Force. He would strafe. He would go low, down into the killing zone where German anti-aircraft guns could reach him, where a single burst could tear through his Mustang's liquid-cooled engine, where one well-aimed shell could end everything. He would hunt German aircraft on their own airfields and destroy them where they sat. Righetti climbed out of the jeep and walked toward his P-51 Mustang Katydid, named for his wife. The aircraft's natural metal skin gleamed in the early light. Dark green and yellow checkered markings adorned the nose, the standard pattern of the 55th Fighter Group. Painted on the fuselage were small symbols marking his victories. 7.5 kills in aerial combat. 27 aircraft destroyed on the ground, more than any other pilot in the 8th Air Force. He was the king of strafers, and everyone knew it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His crew chief saluted as Righetti approached. The young sergeant had prepared Katydid with the care of someone who understood that his work might determine whether his pilot came home. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, loaded and ready. 400 rounds per gun. Fuel tanks topped off. Oil levels checked. Every mechanical system inspected. The Mustang was ready to kill. Righetti returned the salute and eased himself into the cockpit. The familiar smell of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and gun oil surrounded him. He settled into the seat, adjusted his parachute straps, connected his oxygen mask and radio leads. Through the canopy he could see other pilots climbing into their aircraft across the hard stands. The 55th Fighter Group was preparing for war. What none of them fully understood, what even Righetti himself could not have articulated, was that they were about to participate in one of the war's great ironies. In 1945, with Allied air superiority complete and German defeat inevitable, low-level strafing attacks had become more dangerous than ever before. The Luftwaffe could barely defend German skies, but the ground defenses, the anti-aircraft guns that ringed every airfield and military installation, remained lethal. Pilots who had survived years of combat against German fighters were being shot down by Flak during what should have been easy targets. The practice of ground strafing had become controversial within the 8th Air Force. Some commanders viewed it as wasteful, trading experienced pilots and expensive aircraft for destroyed enemy planes that would never fly anyway. The Germans lacked fuel. They lacked pilots. They lacked the capacity to mount meaningful air operations. Why risk irreplaceable American lives to destroy aircraft that posed no threat? but others, including Major General Jimmy Doolittle, who commanded the 8th Air Force, saw strategic value in continuing the pressure. Every German aircraft destroyed on the ground was one less that might somehow, miraculously, get airborne for a final desperate defense. Every locomotive destroyed was one less moving troops or supplies. Every target struck was another nail in the Reich's coffin. And perhaps most importantly, from the pilot's perspective, Doolittle had issued a policy that made strafing attractive. Aircraft destroyed on the ground counted equally with aerial victories for official credit. A pilot could build his score without risking dogfights. This policy had transformed the nature of fighter operations over Europe. In the early years of the war, fighter pilots had dreamed of aerial combat, of the romance of dogfighting at altitude, where skill and courage determined survival. By 1945, much of the fighting had moved to the deck, to brutal, unglamorous attacks against ground targets, where the primary threat came not from enemy pilots, but from teenage conscripts manning 88mm guns. Righetti excelled at this new kind of warfare. He had arrived in England in October 1944, a lieutenant colonel with extensive flying experience but no combat record. At 29 years old, he was ancient by fighter pilot standards. Most squadron commanders were in their early 20s. Some questioned whether this older pilot with no battle experience could lead men who had been fighting for years. Within weeks, those questions had been answered. Righetti was aggressive, fearless, and extraordinarily skilled at low-level attack. He seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of how to approach a target, where to aim, how to maximize destruction while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. He destroyed locomotives, trucks, aircraft, anything that might aid the German war effort. His aggressiveness infected the entire 55th Fighter Group. Under his leadership, the unit's kill total soared. On February 22, 1945, Righetti had been promoted to command the entire group, replacing Colonel George Crowell, whose tour had ended. In the following weeks, the 55th had achieved remarkable results. On February 25th, 3 days after Righetti took command, the group destroyed 14 Luftwaffe aircraft, including 7 Me-262 jet fighters. In March, they were credited with 55 aircraft destroyed, including 6 by Righetti personally, 3 of them Me-262s. The unit had become famous within the 8th Air Force. General Doolittle himself had remarked to Righetti at a conference, "Righetti, I've heard of you." But fame carried a price. Every mission Righetti flew increased the statistical likelihood that he would not return. The mathematics of combat aviation were unforgiving. Fly enough missions, and eventually the odds caught up, a mechanical failure at low altitude. A lucky shot from a gun crew, a moment of inattention at the wrong time. Death could come from 1,000 sources, and the only way to avoid it completely was to stop flying. Righetti could have stopped. He had flown enough hours. He had earned his ticket home. The war would end without him. But on this morning, his 30th birthday, he climbed into Katydid and prepared to hunt one more time. The engine coughed to life with a roar that shook the airframe. Righetti advanced the throttle, feeling the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin respond with smooth, reliable power. 1,290 horsepower driving a 4-bladed propeller. The Mustang began to move, weaving as Righetti fishtailed to see around the long nose. Other aircraft fell into line behind him, a long snake of fighters preparing to hunt. He reached the runway threshold and looked over at his wingman, First Lieutenant Carroll Henry. Henry was young, eager, dependable. He flashed Righetti a smile. The 2 aircraft rolled onto the runway together. Righetti eased the throttle forward. The engine's roar became a thunder. At just over 100 miles per hour, the tail lifted. Seconds later, both Mustangs were airborne, climbing into the spring sky over England, heading east toward Germany, toward Dresden, toward an airfield near Riesa, where 8 German aircraft sat waiting to be destroyed, toward a place where Elwyn Righetti would vanish from history and enter legend. To understand why Righetti made the choices he did on April 17, 1945, we must understand the world of fighter aviation as it had evolved by the war's final months. The 8th Air Force had begun operations from England in 1942 with a doctrine built on daylight precision bombing. The theory was elegant. American bombers, flying in TUC, tight defensive formations at high altitude, would strike specific industrial targets with unprecedented accuracy. The combined defensive firepower of massed heavy bombers would protect them from enemy fighters without requiring long-range escorts. The theory proved catastrophically wrong. German fighters tore apart unescorted American bomber formations throughout 1943. The worst single example came on October 14, 1943, when the 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses to bomb ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. 60 bombers were shot down. 17 more returned so badly damaged they were scrapped. Of the 291 aircraft that had taken off that morning, only 33 returned unscathed. 642 casualties among the 2,900 men who had flown the mission. The Air Force called it Black Thursday, and it effectively ended the doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing. The solution arrived in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang equipped with the Packard-built Merlin engine. The P-51B and C models began arriving in England in December 1943. The P-51D, with its bubble canopy providing all-around visibility, began arriving in large numbers in early 1944. These aircraft could escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany and still have fuel for combat. But the Mustang brought more than just range. It brought a fundamental shift in American fighter doctrine. In January 1944, Major General Jimmy Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle, already famous for his 1942 raid on Tokyo, was aggressive and unconventional. He made a controversial decision that bomber crews initially resented. He changed the primary mission of escort fighters from defending bombers to destroying German fighters wherever they could be found. Under the previous policy, American fighters stayed close to the bomber formations, providing direct protection. This minimized bomber losses but allowed German fighters to attack on their own terms and escape when outnumbered. Doolittle ordered his fighters to range ahead of the bombers, to patrol aggressively, to pursue German fighters rather than remaining in defensive formation. The goal was not merely to protect bombers during a single mission, but to destroy the Luftwaffe itself. The policy worked. Throughout 1944, American fighters systematically destroyed German air power in the skies over the Reich. But Doolittle's vision extended beyond aerial combat. He authorized, indeed encouraged, fighters returning from escort missions to strafe targets of opportunity on the ground. Airfields, trains, vehicles, anything that might support the German war effort. To make this policy attractive to pilots, the 8th Air Force decided that aircraft destroyed on the ground would count equally with aerial victories for official credit. This was not an official ACE designation, which the Army Air Forces never formally recognized, but it mattered to pilots and their reputations. A fighter pilot could become famous for destroying locomotives and grounded aircraft without ever engaging in a dogfight. This decision created what amounted to a hunter's paradise for aggressive pilots. Germany in 1944 and 1945 was target-rich. Trains moved constantly despite Allied bombing. Airfields dotted the landscape, many with aircraft parked in the open or in flimsy dispersal areas. Vehicles crowded the roads. For a pilot willing to go low and accept the risks, Opportunities for destruction were everywhere, but the risks were substantial. High-altitude aerial combat, while dangerous, offered certain protections. A fighter at 25,000 feet had space to maneuver, time to react, energy to trade for survival. A fighter at 200 feet had none of these advantages. A hit to the coolant system meant the engine would seize within minutes. A damaged propeller meant reduced power. Any structural damage might make the aircraft unflyable. And at low altitude, there was no time to bail out if something went catastrophically wrong. German anti-aircraft defenses in 1945 were, in many ways, more dangerous than they had been earlier in the war. The Luftwaffe had largely abandoned attempts to defend German skies with fighters, concentrating instead on protecting key installations with dense networks of anti-aircraft guns. These ranged from small-caliber machine guns to 88mm Flak guns to larger weapons. The lighter guns, particularly the 20mm and 37mm weapons, were especially lethal against low-flying aircraft. German airfields by 1945 were typically ringed with anti-aircraft positions. A pilot making a strafing run would have to fly through curtains of fire to reach his target. The defensive gunners had one enormous advantage. They knew the pilot had to commit to his attack run. Once a fighter began its dive toward a target, its path became predictable. The gunners simply had to fill that path with enough projectiles to ensure hits. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine that gave the Mustang its performance also gave it a critical vulnerability. A single bullet through the radiator or coolant lines meant mission failure. The pilot would have perhaps 5 minutes before the engine overheated and seized. At low altitude, deep in enemy territory, 5 minutes was rarely enough time to reach friendly lines. The pilot faced a choice: crash land immediately and hope to evade capture, or try to gain altitude and bail out, risking being shot while hanging helpless in a parachute. Many 8th Air Force pilots were reluctant to strafe despite the official encouragement and the promise of ground kills counting toward their scores. They had not survived years of combat by taking unnecessary risks. With the war obviously nearing its end, why risk death or capture attacking targets that posed no real threat? German aircraft sitting on airfields lacked fuel to fly. German locomotives were running out of places to go. Why trade an experienced American pilot for a target that would be overrun by ground forces within weeks? But others, including Righetti, saw the situation differently. They had come to Europe to fight. They had trained for years to be fighter pilots. The fact that the enemy was beaten did not diminish their desire to complete the mission thoroughly. Every German aircraft destroyed was one that could not somehow be made operational for a final, desperate sortie. Every train destroyed was one less moving supplies that might prolong the war. Every day the war continued, Allied soldiers died. Anything that might hasten the end was worth doing. There was also, though few would admit it openly, the simple hunter's instinct. Fighter pilots were selected for aggression. They were trained to attack. The most successful among them possessed an almost predatory drive to find and destroy the enemy. Righetti exemplified this trait. He was relentless in seeking targets, creative in his approaches, ruthless in pressing attacks. When other pilots saw an airfield defended by Flak and decided to seek easier targets, Righetti calculated how to get in, do maximum damage, and get out alive. His 27 ground kills by April 1945 represented hundreds of attack runs, thousands of bullets fired, countless moments when a single error would have killed him. He had developed techniques that worked: approach from unexpected angles, use terrain for concealment, vary altitude and timing to confuse gunners, fire accurate bursts rather than hosing bullets wildly, break away hard and low, using speed and maneuverability to evade rather than simply flying straight and hoping. These techniques kept him alive through mission after mission, but they also encouraged him to take risks that more cautious pilots avoided. On April 17th, with his combat tour nearly complete and the war nearly over, those techniques and that aggressiveness would lead him to make one final attack, one final dive toward enemy aircraft on the ground, one final bet that his skill would be enough to survive one more time. Elwyn Guido Righetti was born on April 17, 1915, on a ranch near San Luis Obispo, California. He grew up working cattle, fixing equipment, learning the practical skills of ranching life. He attended California Polytechnic State College, graduating in 1935 with a degree in meat animals. He was not a natural candidate for fighter pilot, being older than most recruits when he joined the Army Air Forces. By the time he arrived in England in October 1944, he was 29 years old, ancient by the standards of a fighter group where most squadron commanders were in their early 20s. But Righetti brought something the younger pilots often lacked. He brought maturity, mechanical understanding, and an instinctive grasp of how machines worked. He understood the P-51 Mustang not just as a weapons platform, but as a complex system of interconnected vulnerabilities. The aircraft he flew, Katydid, was a P-51D-10, serial number 44-14223. It was powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1657 engine producing 1,490 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The engine was a masterpiece of British engineering adapted for American mass production. 12 cylinders arranged in a 60-degree V configuration. A two-stage, two-speed supercharger enabling high-altitude performance. And a liquid cooling system that was simultaneously the aircraft's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The cooling system worked through a closed circuit of ethylene glycol coolant. The coolant absorbed heat from the engine cylinders, flowed through brass tubes sealed with rubber gaskets to the header tank mounted immediately behind the propeller spinner, then traveled back through lines to the radiator mounted in the aircraft's belly, beneath and behind the cockpit. A concentrated high-velocity flow of air through the radiator dissipated the heat, and the cooled liquid returned to the engine to absorb more heat in a continuous cycle. This system allowed the Merlin to produce enormous power for its weight. The ethylene glycol coolant could operate at temperatures between 250 and 280 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than the 212-degree maximum of water-cooled systems. This higher operating temperature meant smaller radiators, less weight, less drag, better performance. The P-51 could cruise at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour and climb to altitudes above 40,000 feet. It had a combat radius of 750 miles with drop tanks, enabling it to escort bombers to any target in Germany and still have fuel for combat. But the entire system depended on maintaining coolant integrity. The lines running from the engine to the header tank and from the header tank to the radiator were exposed along the fuselage sides. The radiator itself sat in the belly scoop, vulnerable to ground fire from below. A single bullet through any coolant line would cause a leak. Once the coolant level dropped, the engine would begin to overheat. Temperatures would climb rapidly. Within 5 minutes, perhaps less, the engine would seize from thermal damage, its pistons welding themselves to the cylinder walls, its bearings destroying themselves from a lack of lubrication. At altitude, a pilot with a damaged cooling system had options. He could shut down the engine immediately and glide toward friendly territory. He might cover 20 or 30 miles for every mile of altitude he lost. He could bail out and hope to be rescued, or evade capture. He had time to think, to plan, to make decisions. At low altitude during a strafing attack, these options disappeared. A pilot at 500 feet with a damaged cooling system had perhaps 3 minutes of engine power remaining. He was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, with no friendly lines within gliding distance. His choices reduced to two: crash land immediately and face capture or worse, or use those final minutes of power to complete the attack, destroy as many targets as possible, then crash land anyway. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Righetti had spent 6 months learning these limitations through experience. He had flown missions where other pilots suffered coolant damage and barely made it home. He had seen aircraft force land in friendly territory, their engines seized solid. He knew the clock that began ticking the moment a coolant line was breached. And on April 17, 1945, that knowledge would define his final decisions. The B-17 bombers appeared as specks ahead, growing larger as Righetti's fighter group closed the distance. White squares marked the tail surfaces, identifying them as aircraft from the 3rd Air Division. The bombers were heading toward Dresden, moving in their tight defensive formations through clear spring skies. The Luftwaffe did not challenge them. German fighters had become so scarce that escort duty had transformed into an exercise in waiting. The bombers reached their targets, dropped their ordnance, turned for home. The 55th Fighter Group's official responsibility ended. Righetti called to his pilots. They were released to hunt targets of opportunity. He took one squadron down from altitude, descending through scattered clouds toward the landscape below. First, Lieutenant Colonel Henry stayed on his wing, maintaining formation as they dropped through 5,000 feet, through 3,000, down to where individual features on the ground became visible: roads, rail lines, buildings, fields. They were northeast of Dresden, trolling across enemy territory, looking for anything worth destroying. Someone called out an airfield at 10 o'clock. Righetti turned toward it, descending further. Through breaks in the clouds, he could see aircraft on the ground, dispersed around the field's perimeter, German aircraft sitting exposed. He called for the rest of the flight to orbit at altitude, while he went down to check for anti-aircraft defenses. Henry asked if he could come along. Righetti agreed. The 2 Mustangs dropped to 500 feet and made a pass across the northern edge of the airfield, flying east to west. Below them, Riesa-Kanitz Airfield spread across the countryside. It was not a major installation, just one of hundreds of small fields scattered across Germany where the Luftwaffe had dispersed its dwindling air, forced to protect against Allied bombing. But aircraft were aircraft, and every one destroyed was one that could not fly. As they crossed the field, Henry spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 landing from the northeast, its landing gear down. The pilot committed to his approach. Righetti directed Henry to take it. Henry broke toward the field, descended to deck level, and pursued the German fighter. His 650 caliber machine guns opened fire. The Focke-Wulf, slow and vulnerable with its gear extended, took multiple hits. It crashed short of the runway. Henry pulled up hard, evading streams of tracer fire from anti-aircraft positions around the field. He flew low for 3 miles, weaving to avoid the flak, then climbed back up to find Righetti. Righetti had not waited. He had seen other aircraft parked around the airfield. He rolled into a strafing run, descending toward the targets with his gun sight fixed on stationary shapes. His 6 machine guns carried 400 rounds each, 2,400 rounds total. At a combined rate of fire approaching 3,600 rounds per minute, his guns could empty their ammunition in approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Righetti did not fire sustained bursts. He fired in controlled 2-second triggers, 5 to 6-second bursts, walking his fire across each target. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the Mustang's wings. were devastating against parked aircraft. Each gun fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds mixed with standard ball ammunition. The armor-piercing rounds could penetrate aircraft skin, fuel tanks, engines. The incendiary rounds ignited fuel and hydraulic fluid. A 2-second burst from 6 guns placed approximately 120 rounds into a small area. Even a handful of hits could destroy an aircraft on the ground. Righetti's first pass destroyed one aircraft. He pulled up, circled, came around for another run. Another aircraft exploded. He made a third pass, then a fourth. German anti-aircraft crews tracked his movements, training their guns on the paths he was flying. 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons pumped shells into the air, creating curtains of fire that Righetti had to fly through to reach his targets. On his 5th or 6th pass, he felt Katydid shudder. There was a loud bang. The aircraft vibrated differently. Carol Henry, climbing back to altitude after destroying the landing Focke-Wulf, saw anti-aircraft rounds streak past Righetti's fighter. He watched the Mustang trail white vapor. Coolant vapor. Henry called on the radio. He reported seeing coolant streaming from Righetti's aircraft. Righetti must have known immediately what it meant. Somewhere in the cooling system, a shell fragment or bullet had opened a breach. The pressurized coolant was venting into the slipstream. The engine temperature would already be rising. He had minutes, perhaps less, before the Merlin seized. The rational decision was immediate retreat. Turn west toward friendly lines. Climb to gain altitude for gliding distance. Use whatever engine time remained to get as far from enemy territory as possible. Find an open field. Crash land. Hope for survival and evasion. Righetti made a different decision. His radio transmission, heard by Henry and other pilots on the frequency, was matter of fact. He said he had enough ammunition for one more pass. He hauled the Mustang around, descended again toward the airfield, and made another strafing run. His guns hammered another parked aircraft. It erupted in flames. Righetti pulled up, clearing the anti-aircraft fire by meters, and turned west. Henry tried to stay with him, but Righetti was moving fast, using every bit of remaining engine power to gain distance from the airfield. The Mustang climbed slightly, then leveled off. Righetti's voice came over the radio again, calm, reporting his situation to anyone listening. The engine was failing. He was going down. He told Henry and the others that he had gotten 9 aircraft that day. He said to tell his family he was all right. He said it had been swell working with them. The phrase was characteristic of Righetti. Understated, matter of fact. He was about to crash land in enemy territory, with the war weeks from ending, about to become a prisoner or worse, and his transmission sounded like he was saying goodbye after a routine training flight. Henry watched from above as Katydid descended toward the countryside southwest of Risa. The Mustang was leaking more coolant now, leaving a white trail across the sky. The engine was still running, but its sound had changed. The smooth roar had become rough, uneven. Righetti picked a field, lined up his approach, and brought the Mustang down. Without landing gear, the aircraft bellied in. Metal shrieked against earth. Dirt and debris flew up around the fuselage. The fighter slid hundreds of feet across the ground, decelerating from over 100 miles per hour to a stop. The canopy opened. Righetti climbed out onto the wing, apparently uninjured. Henry circled overhead, watching. He could see his group commander standing beside the wrecked Mustang, alone in a German field. Then Henry lost sight of him. He made another orbit, searching for Righetti on the ground. He could not locate him. Being alone, separated from his wingman, deep in enemy territory with German civilians and soldiers potentially converging on the crash site, Henry made the difficult decision to head west. He advanced his throttle and climbed, leaving behind the man he had been assigned to protect. Other pilots in the 55th Fighter Group heard the radio transmissions. Righetti was down. He had survived the crash. He had radioed that he was okay, but no one saw him again. No prisoner of war reports listed his name. No camps reported his arrival. When Allied forces overran the area weeks later and investigators searched for information about American pilots who had crashed in the region, they found nothing about Righetti. No grave, no witness reports, no documentation. The area where he crashed fell within the Soviet zone of occupation. American investigators had limited access. Soviet authorities provided little assistance. The trail ended at that field southwest of Riesa, where Colonel Henry had last seen his commander standing beside a wrecked Mustang named Katydid. Having destroyed 8 aircraft on an airfield he should have left alone, having used his final minutes of engine power to attack one more time rather than flee. The 55th Fighter Group returned to Wormingford that evening minus their commanding officer. The pilots who had heard Righetti's final radio transmission sat in silence during the debriefing. Lieutenant Colonel Henry described what he had witnessed. Righetti's aircraft leaking coolant. The final strafing pass despite the damage. The crash landing. The sight of his commander standing beside the wrecked Mustang. Then nothing. The group intelligence officer recorded the details in the mission summary report for April 17, 1945. 9 aircraft destroyed on the ground credited to Lieutenant Colonel Righetti. 1 Focke-Wulf 190 destroyed by Lieutenant Henry. 1 P-51D Mustang, serial number 44-14223, Katydid, lost to anti-aircraft fire. Commander missing in action. And then the intelligence officer added something unusual to an official military document. A personal note. "We're going to miss you, Colonel. All 29 years of your bursting energy and vitality, your eagerness and courage, your initiative and leadership that molded us into the finest damned fighting team the Air Forces have ever seen. God bless you. Good luck. Goodbye." The war ended 3 weeks later. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The 55th Fighter Group flew its final combat mission on April 25th, just 8 days after Righetti's disappearance. The unit had completed 472 missions over 31 months of combat operations. They had destroyed more than 900 enemy aircraft, approximately half in aerial combat and half on the ground. They had lost 241 aircraft and 179 pilots killed or missing. As Allied forces occupied Germany, investigators began the grim work of accounting for missing American personnel. Teams searched crash sites, interviewed witnesses, examined German records, and attempted to identify remains. The area where Righetti had crashed fell within the Soviet occupation zone near Riesa, southwest of Dresden. American investigators had limited access. Soviet authorities provided minimal cooperation. The investigation into Righetti's fate produced no results. German civilians in the area were questioned. None admitted to seeing an American pilot after the crash. No one reported witnessing a capture by German military or police forces. No prisoner of war records listed Righetti's arrival at any camp. No hospital records showed treatment of an American pilot with injuries consistent with his reported broken nose. No burial records indicated disposition of remains. It was as if Elwyn Righetti had simply ceased to exist the moment Colonel Henry lost sight of him on the ground. The most likely explanation, the one that investigators reluctantly concluded, was that Righetti had been murdered by German civilians. By April 1945, German civilian populations were experiencing the full weight of Allied air power. Cities were burning. Transportation networks were shattered. Food supplies were collapsing. Daily life had become a struggle for survival amid constant bombing and strafing attacks. American fighter pilots who descended to low altitude to strafe trains, vehicles, and airfields sometimes attacked anything that moved, including civilian transportation. German propaganda had labeled these pilots Terrorflieger, terror flyers, and portrayed them as war criminals deliberately targeting civilians. In the war's final months, numerous Allied airmen who parachuted over Germany or crash-landed in German territory were murdered by angry civilians before military authorities could intervene. The collapse of civil order, the breakdown of military discipline, and the accumulated rage of years of bombing created conditions where lynch mobs formed quickly. Some pilots were beaten to death. Others were shot or hanged. Local Nazi Party officials sometimes organized or encouraged these killings. In other cases, they simply failed to prevent them. Righetti, standing beside his crashed aircraft in rural Germany, wearing his flight suit and sidearm, would have been immediately identifiable as an American fighter pilot. He was exactly the kind of pilot German propaganda had demonized. He had just destroyed 8 aircraft on a nearby airfield. The sound of his strafing runs would have been heard for miles. Anyone approaching his crash site would have known what he had been doing minutes before. Whether he was killed immediately at the crash site or captured and murdered later, whether the perpetrators were military personnel, police, party officials, or simply enraged civilians, no evidence survived. No witness ever came forward. No grave was ever found. No remains were ever identified. Righetti vanished as completely as if he had never existed. His family held out hope for months, then years. His wife Catherine waited for news that never came. His daughter Kine, who had been just 2 years old when her father left for England, grew up with only photographs and letters to know him by. His parents and siblings kept a light burning at the family ranch near San Luis Obispo, a tradition they maintained for decades. Each time one of them died, the last living family members continued to light that lamp, hoping that somehow Elwyn might still come home. The official declaration of death came on April 18, 1946, exactly 1 year and 1 day after his disappearance. The Army Air Forces promoted him posthumously to full colonel. They awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, for his actions on April 17th. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism in aerial combat, his destruction of enemy aircraft despite battle damage to his own fighter, and his courage in making one final attack even after his aircraft had been crippled. He received the Silver Star posthumously in July 1945. He had already earned the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters for his combat performance during his 6 months with the 55th Fighter Group. His final tally stood at 7½ aerial victories and 27 aircraft destroyed on the ground, making him the most successful ground attack pilot in the 8th Air Force. No other pilot in the European theater had destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground. But these awards and statistics did not address the fundamental question that haunted everyone who knew his story. Why had he made that final strafing pass? His aircraft was leaking coolant. He knew the engine would fail within minutes. He had already destroyed 8 aircraft. His mission was accomplished. He could have turned west immediately, used his remaining engine power to gain altitude and distance, and given himself the best possible chance of reaching friendly territory or at least crash landing in a less hostile area. Instead, he made one more attack. He used precious minutes and engine power to destroy 1 more German aircraft. Then he crashed in enemy territory with no possibility of rescue, miles from Allied lines, surrounded by a population that had every reason to hate American fighter pilots. The decision made no tactical sense. It accomplished nothing that mattered. The war would end in 3 weeks regardless of whether that 9th aircraft was destroyed, and it cost Righetti everything. Some who knew him suggested the decision reflected his personality. He was aggressive almost to the point of recklessness. He sought combat rather than avoiding it. He led from the front and demanded that his pilots follow his example. Perhaps in that moment, with his aircraft damaged and his engine failing, he simply could not resist attacking one more time. Perhaps the hunter's instinct overrode rational calculation. Others argued that he was thinking about his men. He was their commander. He had pushed them to be aggressive, to attack despite danger, to close with the enemy and destroy them. How could he ask his pilots to take risks he would not take himself? By making that final pass, despite the damage to his aircraft, he was demonstrating the courage he expected from them. He was showing that a leader does not quit while targets remain and ammunition remains. Still, others believed he thought he had more time than he actually did. The Merlin engine was robust. It could run for several minutes with coolant loss before catastrophic failure. Perhaps Righetti calculated that he could make one more quick pass, destroy one more target, and still have enough power to reach safety. The calculation, if he made it, proved wrong. But pilots made such calculations constantly, weighing risk against opportunity, betting their lives on their judgment and skill. Whatever his reasoning, the result was the same. He destroyed 9 aircraft that day, more than any pilot in the 8th Air Force had destroyed in a single mission. And he vanished, becoming one of 78,000 American military personnel still missing from World War II, one of thousands who disappeared in the final weeks of the European War, when victory was certain and the end was in sight. The 55th Fighter Group continued operating through the occupation of Germany, then returned to the United States and was deactivated. The pilots scattered to civilian life, carrying with them memories of the commander who had transformed their unit in 6 months and then disappeared on his 30th birthday. Some wrote memoirs. Some gave interviews to historians. All of them remembered Righetti as the most aggressive pilot they had known, the man who had earned the nickname Eager L, the king of strafers who had set a standard no one else matched. In 1993, nearly half a century after his disappearance, author Anthony Meldahl began researching Righetti's life. Meldahl had served in the Army and was fascinated by the story of this pilot who had achieved so much in so little time and then vanished without trace. He collected letters, interviewed surviving family members and fellow pilots, searched archives and official records. He accumulated thousands of pages of documentation and began writing a biography. But Meldahl was diagnosed with terminal cancer before completing the manuscript. Determined that Righetti's story would be told, he contacted military aviation historian J. Stout and asked him to finish the book. Stout agreed. He spent years reviewing Meldahl's research, conducting additional interviews, and crafting the narrative. The result was Vanished Hero, the Life, War, and Mysterious Disappearance of America's Babuhuto Strafing King, published in 2017, 72 years after Righetti's final mission. The story of Elwyn Righetti's final mission reveals something essential about the nature of air combat in 1945, something that extends beyond individual heroism or tactical decisions. It illuminates the strange mathematics of a war that was simultaneously won and lethal, finished and ongoing, decided strategically but still costing lives daily. By April 17, 1945, the outcome of World War II in Europe was no longer in question. Germany was defeated. Its armies were in retreat or surrounded. Its cities were in ruins. Its leadership was hiding in bunkers. The Luftwaffe which had terrorized Europe in 1940 and 1941, barely existed as a fighting force. German pilots lacked fuel, training, and aircraft. The air war over Germany had been won, yet pilots were still dying. They were dying in attacks that served no strategic purpose, destroying targets that posed no threat, fighting an enemy that had already lost. The German aircraft that Righetti strafed at Riesa were sitting on the ground because they had no fuel to fly. The locomotives and vehicles that fighter pilots attacked throughout Germany in those final weeks were moving supplies to armies that could no longer use them effectively. Every target destroyed hastened the end by some infinitesimal amount, but the end was coming regardless. The controversy over strafing that had simmered within the 8th Air Force throughout late 1944 and early 1945 reflected this uncomfortable reality. Yes, strafing missions destroyed enemy materiel and disrupted German military operations, but they also exposed pilots to severe risk from anti-aircraft fire for marginal gains. The losses were disproportionate to the results. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were being shot down in the war's final months attacking targets of questionable value. General Doolittle's policy of crediting ground kills equally with aerial victories had created an incentive structure that encouraged aggressive strafing. Pilots who wanted to build their scores could do so more easily by attacking aircraft on the ground than by engaging in aerial combat, because by 1945 there were few German fighters left to fight. The policy transformed the nature of fighter operations, but also changed the risk calculus. Pilots who might have avoided low-level attacks were instead seeking them out. Righetti exemplified this transformed fighter pilot. He arrived in England with no combat experience but extensive flying skill. Within weeks, he had become the most successful ground attack pilot in the theater. He was promoted rapidly, given command of an entire group, celebrated by senior leadership. His aggressiveness was exactly what the 8th Air Force wanted from its pilots in the war's closing months. Keep the pressure on the enemy. Destroy everything that moves. Make the German military's final days as miserable and costly as possible. But that aggressiveness, combined with the relentless drive to attack, led him to make one more pass when his aircraft was crippled, to destroy one more target when he should have fled, to bet his life one more time when the odds had turned decisively against him. The same qualities that made him a successful combat leader also made him take the risk that killed him. His loss accomplished nothing strategically. The 9 aircraft he destroyed that day were already effectively destroyed by Germany's lack of fuel and pilots. The 8th Air Force did not need those aircraft eliminated. The war would have ended on exactly the same day whether or not Righetti had made that final mission. His death served no purpose except to add one more name to the list of American personnel who died after victory was assured, but before fighting stopped. This is the bitter irony at the heart of his story. He died destroying targets that did not matter in a war that was already won on his 30th birthday, weeks before he would have gone home to his wife and daughter. He died because he was aggressive and skilled and driven to attack. He died because he could not stop being the pilot the Air Force had trained him to be and rewarded him for being. He died because even when the rational choice was retreat, the culture and incentives and personal identity he had built pushed him toward one more attack. Today, Colonel Elwyn Righetti is memorialized on the tablets of the missing at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. His name is carved into stone alongside thousands of other Americans who were killed in Europe and whose remains were never recovered or identified. Visitors to the cemetery can see his name, read the brief inscription, and wonder about the man behind it. But the details of his life and death, the specifics of that final mission over Germany, the choice he made to attack one more time despite fatal damage to his aircraft. These elements of his story are gradually fading from memory. The generation that knew him personally is gone. The pilots who flew with him have died. His daughter, Kine, grew up without her father and has spent her life trying to understand why he did not come home. The morning of April 17th, 1945, began with Elwyn Righetti sitting in a jeep at an English airfield, looking at a mission slip, making the decision to fly one more time. It ended with him standing beside a wrecked Mustang in a German field, alone, surrounded by enemies, having just destroyed 9 aircraft in a war that would end in 3 weeks. He disappeared into history at that moment, one more casualty of a conflict that had already been decided, one more name on a memorial wall, one more story of courage and loss and the terrible mathematics of war that continued killing men even after victory was certain. The question his story poses cannot be answered with certainty. Was the final strafing pass an act of heroism or an act of folly? Was it the decision of a brave commander setting an example for his men, or the decision of an aggressive pilot who could not resist one more target? Was it a calculated risk that simply did not pay off, or was it recklessness that cost him everything? Perhaps it was all of these things simultaneously. Perhaps in war, especially in the strange twilight of a war's ending when fighting continues but outcomes are determined, the line between heroism and waste becomes impossible to draw clearly. What is certain is that on his 30th birthday, Elwyn Righetti made a choice that killed him, destroyed an aircraft the United States could easily replace, and accomplished a mission that history barely remembers. The German aircraft he burned that day were footnotes. His own disappearance became a mystery that remains unsolved 80 years later. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.